In this section, we're going to talk about data-driven testing. We'll do an overview with a demo, and then I'll go through some approaches for the built-in way that Robot Framework allows us to do it. And then we'll talk about using an external CSV data file, a JSON data file, and Excel data file. So what's data-driven testing all about? If you've done quality assurance for any amount of time, you know that there are some times when you have to examine how different classes of data will perform in the same test procedure. And a perfect example of this would be something like login for a website. Obviously, when you provide a valid email address and a valid password and you click on submit, the expected result is you'll get into the system under test. But there are several negative testing scenarios that should be covered as well. And you could create a separate test case for each one of these, and that would include things like supplying a valid email with an invalid password. And when you do that and click on submit, in theory, you're going to get an error message. We'll call it error message 1. Then you could supply a valid email with a blank password. And depending upon how the system is designed, you'll either get the same error message or a different error message. We could call that error message 2. Then if you put in a blank email and a blank password, ideally you'd get a different kind of error message 3. And if you put in an unregistered email, meaning somebody who has not signed up for the service and will not be found in the database, along with a valid password, then you would get error message number 4. So like I said, you could create 4 different test cases for these and test each one individually, or since they're all effectively doing the same thing, meaning supplying an email, supplying a password, and then clicking a submit button and checking in the error message, it's really the same thing over and over again. So ideally what you could do is you could loop through a series of different data values in the same test case and keep track of which ones passed and which ones failed. So another scenario we could do would be something like data setup. Automation doesn't always have to test things. So we could use the same concept of iterating through a file of different data rows to actually do setup. So maybe when the development team deploys a new instance of the application under test, maybe you can use Jenkins to trigger a particular scenario that will do a data-driven process to register 100 new users into the system under test from an external file like CSV or JSON or even Microsoft Excel. So whether you're doing a testing scenario like login or verifying that different kinds of people can register, or whether you're doing data setup, understanding how Robot Framework can load up multiple rows of data from a file and process them through one test case is a great skill to have. So let's go have a demo and see how this works. So here's a great example of a typical test automation project that has 3 separate test cases testing negative conditions. You can see in the first one, unregistered user should see correct error message at login. So that's an email address that's not registered in the system, but we've provided a valid password. In the second test case, login with invalid password should show correct error message. So this is a registered user who's providing an incorrect password. And then finally, attempting to log in with a blank email and a blank password should show a different error message than the previous 2. So you can see that ultimately though, these 3 test cases are doing the exact same 3 steps, just with different data in each one. We're telling the Cars app to navigate to the sign-in page, attempt a login with some credentials, then verify that the login page's error message matches what we would expect for the input data we've provided. So in my input data file, you can see that I've provided 3 rows with email, password, and an expected error message value. So yes, we can test each of these negative scenarios with a different test case, but again, since they're all running through the same 3 steps, just with different data, a better approach to use would be to create one test case that says something like negative login scenarios should produce correct error messages. And then we would iterate through those 3 rows of data in one test case. If one of them failed, we wouldn't bail out of the test case. We would simply keep track of the error and then move on to the next row of data. So I'm going to go ahead and run this so you can see it work with these 3 separate test cases. And then in the next lectures, I'll show you how we can refactor this into one data-driven test case using Robot Framework's built-in data-driven feature, or using an external CSV data file, or an external JSON data file, or even an external Excel data file. So I'll open up my terminal and paste in my run command, and away we go. You can see it navigates to cars.com login page. It supplies the invalid email address, and we get that error message. Then it moves on to the next test case, and it supplies the valid email address. invalid password, and we get a second error. And now for the third scenario, we'll provide an empty email address and password and click submit. And now we see that third error message. So in the next few lectures, let's see how we can take something like this with 3 separate test cases and turn it into something more like this, where we have one test case that does something like get me a list of invalid login scenarios by engaging our data manager.getJSON data, and we'll pass in a file path to a JSON file that has that information in it. And then we'll tell the Cars app to log in with many invalid credentials, and we'll pass in that set of data that we got back from our data manager. And inside this keyword, it will loop through all of the data rows, do the work, and then verify that each error message is what we would expect. A couple of key things that are going to drive this approach will be creating a custom library, whether it be a JSON library or a CSV library or Excel. And then instead of putting our input data into the input-data.robot file, we'll use a JSON file or a CSV file respectively. And of course, I'll also show you how we can use the built-in robot framework data-driven feature as well. Let's get to it.